Hello, I'm Bill Leifold, and welcome to this edition of Breakfast at the Barracks. Joining me is Paula Caligiuri, Professor of Human Resource Management in the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers, New Brunswick. Paula, welcome.
Thanks, Bill. It's nice to be here.
We're excited to have you.
I'm excited to be here.
One of the things that you're really well known for is the conversation around career.
Correct.
And on your website, you started a great conversation in your blog recently about the fact that colleges, careers, and parents need to take a different kind of stance than we used to before.
Right.
So can you kind of explain the process? What was the used to before and what's the now?
Sure, sure. Well, if you think about it, it's great that we're doing this here at a university campus talking about this issue. When you think about when we went through school, and the experience was almost identical from what we experienced and what the students are experiencing now, right? They apply, they get in, they go through orientation, classes, professors, majors, graduation, then what? Right? That's all identical.
We'll get to the then what and where am I going, what am I doing?
Right.
Especially if you're a humanities person in some ways.
For example. But what's different now, it used to be the case that employers would hire us on potential, right? Your major, your grades, maybe your letters of recommendation. Now what we're seeing is that employers are looking for absolutely potential, but they're also looking for tangible skills. And that's different. That's really different than what it once was. So now we need to encourage the kids who are going through college right now, we need to encourage them to actually acquire those skills, which again, that's a little bit different than it was before.
Well, let's talk about those acquirement of skills.
Sure, sure.
I'm a product of higher education.
Right.
I love higher education. Obviously, I work here. Higher education is a lot about critical thinking, a lot about writing, a lot about the ability to dialogue and see perspectives. But what other skill sets are employers looking for, and how do students acquire those skill sets during their college career?
Right. It depends on the nature of the position that a student would want. But if you think about the various things that are open to students in a great university like Rutgers, such as, for example, if somebody is interested in doing something with data, they could go work for a professor who's working on a research project. It's a great way to get data management skills. If a student is interested in working in business, perhaps it's getting an additional language in one of those critical languages, Arabic, Mandarin, Spanish, all of those would be terrific right now. Again, adding tangible skills. The other thing that's undervalued, and the students aren't really connecting with yet, is the issue of a network. It's a tremendous opportunity now for students to think about, a guest comes into a class, a guest lecturer, a guest speaker comes into class, to actually make a contact with that person, maybe hand in a resume, exchange a business card, something to enable them to start building their network.
Let's talk about that for a second. This millennial generation is somewhat a little interesting when it comes to the whole network perspective. They seem much more capable at the social networking context, but the human-to-human network, in terms of being a little shy in class, building those networks, seems to be somewhat of a challenge. How would you encourage a parent or a student to kind of look at both of those networks and kind of build both of those networks?
It's explaining the criticality of it. There are two ways, and regardless if they're young graduates or people mid-career, there's two ways people get jobs now. It's the skills they possess and the network, the professional network that they have. That's it. So it's encouraging students to realize the value of that network, and in fact encouraging them and giving them the tools to make those connections, those professional connections, teaching them how to follow up professionally. Those are all so very critical now.
I think the interesting thing is our students don't always know the difference between a career and a job. They seem to be very focused on the job, and they seem to be very focused on the pay. And so can you explain a little difference in terms of your philosophy, in terms of that whole conversation, because I know you've written a whole book about it, and we'll get to that in a second.
Sure. No, I'm not comfortable with the word job, if for no other reason than that traditional 40-hour week, 9-to-5 job. A lot of those what was once considered stable jobs, those are going away. And what we're seeing is that people who have greater stability and greater fulfillment are taking more ownership of their entire career. So where it used to be, we would enter an organization and essentially start a job, and then we almost relinquished control to the organization to help us manage our career. That's going away. And in replacement, what we're seeing is that people are taking greater ownership of their careers, and I think that's exactly where this is all going in the future.
Well, your new book, let's talk a little bit about that, because I think your new book covers a great deal of what you just talked about. Gives some pointers and really gives a philosophy in terms of how to approach this.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I'd love to. So as I mentioned, I advocate that people should have multiple streams of income. I believe that the reliance on any given organization solely is probably the riskiest position we could be in now. We're seeing that again and again with unemployment being high, offshoring, greater use of contingent workers. We absolutely need to rely more on ourselves. The other big punchline of the book is that we should be thinking more about our talents and leveraging our talents and thinking about ways that we can use our talents to in fact be more effective in our income streams. So if you think about biggest concern people have with this is time. Who has time to work more than one job, right? The issue with time that a lot of people don't realize is that if you love what you do, and I interviewed a lot of people for my book, the people who love what they do have a hard time telling me how many hours per week they work.
Okay.
If you talk to someone who dislikes what they do, they can tell you down to the minute how many hours per week they're working.
Well, here's the interesting question for me. We're all taught, especially my generation, an Xer, that you go after the job, you go after the career for some of the money. How do we change some of this dominant culture perspective with 3 generations, sometimes 4 generations now in play, with regards to thinking about this? Because I agree with you. You can tell when folks are passionate about their job. Their eyes light up, their smile comes across their face. They're not saying that work isn't difficult, but they're excited by what they're doing. So how do we kind of change part of that kind of conversation about this isn't that? You know, and go after the talent part as you talk about, because it's so different than kind of what our parents went through, our grandparents went through, and even me went through in terms of being able to have that conversation with a student. It seems such a huge paradigm change.
It is, and there's a couple points of entry that, you know, when you think about someone who's enthusiastic, a young graduate, someone who really wants to have more meaning in their career, they usually butt up against either parents, professors, whomever, who are suggesting that, listen, go to work for a big name company, pay your dues, do your time, and your career will progress. That actually, we need to encourage a student, in fact, to take greater ownership and realize that that company probably isn't going to be managing his or her career. They absolutely do need to be more active in managing their own career.
We're in a hard economic time. And the class of 2009 and the class of 2010, 2009 had some challenges, class of 2010 is going to have a lot of challenges. We're working on talent. We want to be able to get them excited, but they also need to sustain themselves while they kind of do that. So how do you kind of advise a student or advise somebody who has just been laid off to kind of do that? Yes, you need to earn some money to survive, but you also need to really develop those talents to kind of do what you love. How do we advise somebody in that kind of position?
And it actually goes back to your previous question. It's that mindset shift. There was once, and I think it's embedded in the question, right? The mentality that in order to have greater stability, you need to go work for someone else. And I would argue that perhaps one of your career acts, it's a phrase I use in the book, perhaps one of your career acts might be working for someone else, but realize that you can develop alternate and other career acts to also bring in additional forms of income. As soon as you're no longer fully beholden to one organization, you do have greater financial security, greater financial flexibility. The other piece of this, when you have multiple streams of income and you're doing the things you really love and you're leveraging your talents, what the research is finding, it's really quite interesting. We're finding that not only are people more fulfilled, but they also build the 2 things that we started the interview with. They build their skills and they build their network. So what we see is that people who have those multiple streams of income, they have a tendency and the ability to in fact enhance their career faster than those who are working in one traditional 9-to-5 position. So it's financially enhancing, it's skill enhancing, it's network enhancing, and it's a better way to work.
The millennials can listen to you. I think they get that. I think that's how they do that.
Absolutely.
I think the conversation then is, how does the millennial have their conversation with their parent? And I'm being honest, I think that's one of the
true.
things on your blog
Right.
that you're like, listen, parents, life is not as you know it
Right.
or as you experienced it.
Right.
So how does a student start to have that conversation with their parent? Because I think what you bring is extremely valuable. Millennials get it in a heartbeat. That's how they've social networked when they've networked when they were in school. They've done all those things. You know, they've gone from soccer practice to summer camp to they've been involved in some of that in some context,
Right.
developing those skills. But mom and dad, or mom and mom or dad and dad have a very different perspective.
Right, right.
So how does the student start that conversation with their parent about how they're taking advantage of that college perspective?
It's to some extent educating mom and dad, right? Mom and dad, it's not like it was when you went through. Perhaps I'm going to go work for an organization, but I still need to maintain control over my career. So mom and dad, I'm going to keep working on gaining some additional skills. And actually, it's great advice to the new graduates as well. Even if you do go work for an organization full time, keep investing in those two things: your skills and your network. So in part, it's educating mom and dad about the reality of today's labor market, which is very different than what they've experienced.
One of the things I find fascinating is your website. What's the name of your website? Can you give us our address so folks know it?
Sure, it's getalifenotajob.com.
One of the things that you're very clear on your website in terms of your blog, the blog entries are weekly, sometimes daily, in terms of the conversation, kind of the research tied to the book, but it all gives practical application and some serious steps about how to do that. In doing your blog, what's one of the most exciting things or one of the most things that you're excited about in terms of reaching folks?
Wow. I mean, for one, the thrill of the blog was the fact that I am reaching folks. So I love research. I'm an academic. My heart is in academia. But what's fun about the blog is that I really do have a chance to touch thousands of people instead of maybe the few that are reading my journal articles.
Right.
So it's a different way of getting my message out.
And the thing I love about the blog too is it's so easy to understand.
Thanks.
I think the way that you write it is a way that kind of transitions the academic knowledge into a way of just realistic conversations.
Thanks.
And being able to kind of put those out and to be able to have that conversation with them. Your book, in terms of where can we get your book, where can we purchase your book? Because obviously, I always say, grads need to purchase gifts from mom and dad, as well as mom and dad purchasing gifts for the grads. So I think this is a great gift for both of those. So if somebody's interested out there in being able to do that, how do we get your book? How do we be able to make sure that folks understand that this is a really good read and a practical read in terms of what they need to be able to do?
Sure. Well, it's available on Amazon. It's also available in the bookstores. So Barnes & Noble. You can get it in almost every bookseller. Right.
And when we go to the website, it's also
available on the website.
Great. Listen, it's been great to have you. We're running out of time. Mom and dad, students, I really want to encourage you to get the book. It's a great read. It's practical in terms of where we are now, and it's practical in terms of what we do. And a great job. I really appreciate it. So thanks for coming on today.
My pleasure.
We'll be back in a few minutes. Joining me is Richard Harris, Professor of Political Science, Public Policy and Administration. He's also Director of the Senator Walter Rand Institute for Public Affairs at Rutgers Camden. Richard, welcome.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
I think the first thing I need to ask is, what's the mission of the center? Can you describe the background of the center and kind of what do you guys do?
Sure, no problems. Actually, the best way to think about the Walter Rand Institute is that we actually have an inside mission and an outside mission, like many academic research centers. So the outside mission is really providing applied research, technical assistance, and whatever supports are needed for public sector and for nonprofit sector organizations in southern New Jersey. So our service area is primarily the 7 southern counties, so Burlington south. The inside mission is actually to provide some hands-on experience for students who are interested in public issues. And they work on our projects. All of our students are funded either by a scholarship fund that we've developed or by grants that we have. And so we have a variety of students. They could be undergraduates, they could be graduates, they could be from public policy and administration or political science. They could also be from the law school or criminal justice, depending on the projects that we're working on. And I suppose the last important thing to note is that Walter Rand was a much beloved and very effective legislative leader in southern New Jersey and throughout the state. He was affectionately known as Mr. Transportation.
Okay.
And he helped to develop a lot of the transportation infrastructure in New Jersey. So the center was actually named for him to continue his legacy of public service.
There are a couple different areas I want to be able to tackle. I want to be able to tackle kind of the projects you're working on, and I want to tackle how students kind of really do work in the center. I think viewers are always interested about the faculty and student interaction, especially when it comes to applied theory. But let's talk about your current projects. What are the current projects that the center is working on with those 7 counties? Specifically, you know, the city of Camden.
And actually, that's a really good point. I mean, the way we look at our service mission is kind of moving out in concentric circles because we're located in Camden, and like all distressed cities, it has its own set of very unique challenges. And of course, our campus's well-being is linked to the well-being of the city.
Correct.
So a number of the projects we have are focused in Camden. Let me just give you a few.
Okay.
One of them is we're working on prisoner reentry. This is a very important policy problem. In fact, there was a whole package of legislation that was just passed in the New Jersey legislature this past year. I suppose it's fair to say that tough prison sentences over the last couple of decades have swollen the population of our prisons. And all those folks, and they're done with their sentences, have to come back. And they come back to places like Camden. So a city that's already distressed is facing challenges. Newark faces exactly the same thing. We have a grant from the Nicholson Foundation to set up a reentry center in Camden, and it actually just opened for business a couple of months ago.
Reentry, I think the conversation for some of our viewers is reentry in terms of what are some of the specific challenges that when you're in prison and you're serving a prison term, you're incarcerated for 10, 15, 5 years, you leave prison, you come back. What issues really face those reentry folks?
Well, there are enormous challenges. So while someone is in prison, they may be on the hook for child support. So they can come out of prison with no means of employment, and they are facing judgments that will have accrued over the years for child support. So they need legal services so they can deal with that while they're looking for a job. They need to find a place to live. They need to find a place to work. They need to have awareness of their opportunities for education, and they need often to just get a driver's license restored, and if a parole officer just sends them to the Department of Motor Vehicle bureaus, I mean, it can be a nightmare. Some of them may not even have transportation. So the idea of this Reconnect Center is to co-locate a set of services, employment services, legal counseling, mentoring. And Rutgers has been a really important partner, actually donated furniture and computers to do job searches and the like.
So you talk about Camden, specifically since this is located in Camden. How does a center like that help Camden in terms of, you talk about the fact that Camden's already one of those cities that's in trouble, and that a re-entry population kind of furthers that kind of trouble. How do they connect together? How do they kind of, you talk about them helping the prisoners, the reentry folks, the folks who've been incarcerated, but how does that population really impact the city of Camden?
Well, the whole idea of the reentry center is to make sure that we minimize the negative impacts and increase the opportunities to frankly reintegrate these folks into the community. I mean, the idea is that when someone returns from prison, they become part of the community again. And they have to be prepared to do that. And so a number of our partners are faith-based organizations that do mentoring, help people with job employment. Volunteers of America is a really important partner in trying to help prepare these folks to reintegrate into the community, as opposed to leaving them basically adrift, in which case they're likely to recidivate.
The reality of the current economic situation is that difficult to get a job if you have a person who hasn't been incarcerated. So how has the current economic downturn really had an impact on the reentry population?
Well, the simple answer is it's made things a lot more difficult. There's the workforce investment boards in counties and boards of social services are traditional resources that should be leveraged in these kinds of reentry centers. And they're inundated with their own requests now, so it's made life more difficult. I think an advantage we have here, though, is that the RAND Institute has pulled together a steering committee that includes all of these folks, the WIB, churches, Volunteers of America, parole, courts, probation. So you have all the relevant players around the table to try and problem solve. So you're not turning these people loose to work, negotiate the labyrinths of all these different systems. So a lot more challenging than it would be in good economic times, but I think that's all the more reason why this kind of collaborative effort is important.
So you really act as the host. You bring those folks together, you kind of help facilitate those conversations. You give that space for that place to happen.
We do. I mean, the actual language we use is that we're the neutral convener. And that's a really powerful role that universities can play. You're dealing with agencies that don't always communicate and sometimes may have conflicting interests, or they have, their own jobs to do. They report to their own bureaucratic superiors.
Right.
The university, if you pull these people together, can create a neutral space where you can do collaborative problem solving, as opposed to one agency taking the lead and trying to call others to participate.
Another major project I know you're working on is the idea of juvenile prevention. Can you talk a little bit more about that and kind of what you're doing with regards to that?
Sure. This is actually I guess, a related project. This is actually looking a little bit further upstream in the criminal justice system and trying to prevent people from going to prison and then dealing with reentry. This is operated under a grant from the Office of the Attorney General. There are 6 cities in New Jersey that were designated by the OAG for prevention planning councils. And that's, again, another kind of neutral convening function, but this is focused on youth who are at risk. The RAND Institute has the neutral convening and support responsibilities for Trenton, Camden, and Vineland. And the idea there is that the Institute pulls together youth service organizations, the schools, the city leadership, all the people that would be working on youth, and again, tries to get them to collaboratively problem solve. How can we identify what are the resources out there and how can we leverage them? And what the Institute also does is provide a lot of research, best practices research, and hard analytic demographic research that drives the discussions. So we convene people and use data to drive the discussions.
One of the things that was interesting is you talk about with the juvenile program, there was Trenton, there was Camden, which folks I think in New Jersey are always in the news in terms of that conversation. But you said Vineland. Talk to me a little bit about what you have experienced through the RAND Institute about Vineland that folks probably don't think about when it comes to juvenile folks.
Well, Vineland is not unlike a lot of other small urban areas throughout the state. There are a couple of smaller cities in the north. Newark is one of them, but I believe Patterson is another. Vineland is a little bit different than all the others simply because you have this interface of rural agricultural areas around the city and an urban core. And as the agricultural economy has declined, people have moved to the city and it's put more pressure on Bridgeton. And Bridgeton was kind of a regional economic and employment center down there. And as they've hit hard times, they face many of the same challenges, albeit not on the same scale as Trenton and Camden, but they're there as well.
The one thing I wanted to be able to, I appreciate that because I had no clue about Vineland and I was interested to hear about that. Thank you. One of the things that we talked about at the beginning was you talked about the student involvement. And that student involvement is at the center of kind of what you're doing in terms of being able to give them opportunities. How do students help out? I mean, neutral convening, conversations around juvenile, conversations about reentry. How are students involved in those kind of projects?
Well, they're involved in a variety of ways. So every time we have a project, there is a team. that's put together. There is a PI, which is not a private investigator, but a principal investigator, you know, and that's sort of Rutgers speak for the lead on a project. There's a project coordinator, and I should add that almost all of our project coordinators started out at the Institute as students, and as they developed professionally, they moved on to full-time jobs there. And there's usually 1 to 3 students that are assigned to a project, depending on what the needs are. And what the students do is basic research. They can be pulling together data under the supervision of a project coordinator. If there's neutral convening involved, they take notes. They help put an agenda together, they can contact people, and they attend the meetings. And this is an opportunity for them to actually see this neutral convening process and for them to actually meet decision makers in the public and the nonprofit sector. And in fact, a couple of the folks who had worked at the Institute were subsequently hired to work with some of the partners in some of our neutral convening.
So we're talking about skill development, the ability to have practical application in terms of what they're saying, and the ability to be mentored by folks who are either indirectly or directly involved with the projects.
That's right, and I'd also add there's an opportunity for networking and connection. I mean, one of the things that I've found is that the folks with whom we work on our projects, whether they're in the public sector or the nonprofit sector, really embrace the students because they're so energetic, they're so eager. And on the student side, this is an amazing opportunity for them to take what they've learned in sociology or criminal justice or public policy or even business and see how, you know, the rubber meets the road, you know, mixing, you know, blending theory with practice. So it's tremendous for them.
Well, the thing I find interesting about the neutral convener space, especially for a student, is they actually get to see a faculty. They actually get to see agencies, and they actually get to see, you know, those people who are providing service kind of all together brainstorming, trying to figure out how we do this. So they kind of get part of that think tank, so to speak.
That's absolutely right. And the other thing they see is that, you know, as the land-grant university and the state, they get to see the public service mission of the university in play. So, you know, the holy trinity of, you know, university life is research, teaching, and public service. Most students get to see the teaching and the research, and this is a way for them to see the public service. And in fact, I'd go further and I'd say it's an opportunity for them to see how teaching, research, and public service come together.
I would agree with that one. That's a great analogy. Listen, I'm glad you came. I'm glad you made the trip up from Camden to be with us today. We're running out of time. We would love to have you back to talk about some of the outcomes of those 2 new programs and kind of what you're doing.
Enjoy it.
I appreciate it. Well, that's all we have for this time of Breakfast at the Barracks. For more information about any of these subjects we've discussed here today, please visit our website at rutgers.tv. For all of us at the Rutgers Division of Continuing Studies, I'm Bill Leipold. Thanks for watching.